is presented by ABP Live. The Middle East has undergone irrevocable and fervent transitions through time, but perhaps most fundamentally from the beginning of the 20th century till now. Prolific writers and diplomats, Navdeep Suri, Talmiz Ahmad, are in conversation with Navtej Sarna. We've also got Saeed Al-Said. An urgent and enlightening session on the tides of the Middle East and the world stage. Navdeep Suri is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He's previously served as India's ambassador to the UAE, High Commissioner to Australia, ambassador to Egypt, and Consul General in Johannesburg. After acclaimed translations of his grandfather Nanak Singh's novels, Pavitra Papi as a watchmaker and At Vidya Fool as a life incomplete, he has worked on Khuni Vaishakhi, a long poem written by Nanak Singh in 1920 after surviving the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Saeed Al-Said is currently the Science and Technology Advisor at UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Previously, Al-Said occupied several senior positions in organizations across UAE, including the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi, and Emirates Airlines. Talmiz Ahmad joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1974 and held positions in the Indian Mission in New York, London, and Pretoria. After retirement from foreign services, he is now a full-time academic and holds the Ram Sathe Chair in International Studies, Symbiosis International University, Pune. He has published 3 books: Reform in the Arab World, Children of Abraham at War, The Islamist Challenge in West Asia, and the Political Competitions After the Arab Spring. His latest book, West Asia at War, Repression, Resistance, and Great Power Games, will be published shortly. Please welcome Navtej Sarna. Navtej is the author of the novels The Exile and We Weren't Lovers Like That, the short story collection Winter Evenings, non-fiction works, The Book of Nanak, Second Thoughts, and Indians at Herod's Gate, as well as 2 translations, Zafarnama and Savage Harvest. Sarna was India's ambassador to United States till 2018 and also served as India's High Commissioner to UK and ambassador to Israel.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this. I think the music is just finishing, so you will both hear an echo of that and also get some more people coming in as we go along. But let's kick it off with this very distinguished panel that we have. I think I have 2 ambassadors who have served several times in the Middle East, and we have Mr. Al-Said, who has held some very senior positions. You heard the introductions, but I must complete it by saying that Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad on my left has also been ambassador to UAE, to Oman, to Saudi Arabia. So it's decades of experience that you have between the 3 panelists with us. The Middle East is at the best of times in a churn. There's always something happening. When I went to the Middle East, the first thing I was told was, in the Middle East, expect the unexpected. And that proved to be true. I've stayed in a different Israel than my panelists. I did Israel. But everything is interrelated and interconnected. Particularly, so we will start today because everything is focused on Ukraine. And I would really like our panelists to tell us how they are looking at Ukraine, but I don't want to restrict it to that. We should try and broaden the lens, time permitting. So one thing that we have noticed, and I'm going to request Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad to kick this off, is that the Middle East doesn't have a single position on Ukraine. You have within those few countries, you have people who are sitting on the fence, quote unquote. You have people who have gone in favor of Russia, and you have countries who have condemned Russia. Why do you see that happening, Ambassador?
The events, as far as Ukraine is concerned, are part of a continuum. As far as West Asia is concerned, its narrative goes back several years. But there is an element of disenchantment with the United States that has now continued with the Biden administration. There is an unpredictability. There is also an absence of credibility. And therefore, West Asia had already started moving away from the Americans and tried to create its own, it has started creating its own diplomatic initiatives. So there was a churn in the region well before the Ukraine scenario. Ukraine is like a huge rock that has come into a region that is already in turmoil, and it has aggravated that. Now, what had happened earlier? What had happened earlier is that the countries of the region had started interacting amongst each other absent the Americans. And that is the key, that the Americans no longer have a significant role in engineering the movement of events as far as this region is concerned. Turkey has reached out to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Iran and Saudi Arabia have had 5 rounds of dialogue with each other. Israeli president has visited Ankara recently, and we have therefore a very significant change already taking place. All these countries have also reached out to China and Russia and are attempting to maintain a kind of equidistance because the US is not viewed as a reliable partner. Therefore, what you are seeing now in Ukraine is a very bewildering situation. It is the Americans who will fight Russia as far as they are concerned to the last Ukrainian. And that's what they are doing. There was a certain outreach that had already happened. From June onwards, Biden was in dialogue with Putin. And there were several other officials level meetings. Suddenly in December, you see a change from the American side. And I personally feel it is linked with their domestic politics. So what the Americans want to do, what is their agenda? They want to destroy the Russians as a strategic rival in Europe and in global affairs. And secondly, to cripple them economically at home so that they can achieve regime change. Now, this is a kind of American agenda which has been continued. It never goes away. It's always unsuccessful, but it doesn't go away. It is successful only when they use military force.
So can I take you? Sorry.
Yeah, so this is why you find the countries of the region are adopting positions that are in their own national interest rather than accommodating the Americans in this uncertain scenario.
But Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad has started this off with a bang, and he's brought in the Americans when actually in this brilliant book that he's just brought out, West Asia at War, he actually mentions that the Middle East is a place where 4 people meet: the Arab, the Persian, the Turk, and the Jew. And now we have the American. So I'm going to throw this across to Al Said to say that UAE is an American ally as far as we thought in many, many years and for many, many things. And it's a little strange that the UAE is taking a position that the Americans don't like. And are you disenchanted with the US? Is it because the US has been talking possibly to Iran? What is the reason behind UAE's abstention in the Security Council? And don't ask me what's the reason for the Indian abstention. Yeah.
I will not. I will actually say that this specific issue is extremely multi-layered. The singular narrative which you have mentioned, that the UAE is an American ally, has been something that we as a country have been working on for decades. But what are the fruits of this labor is the real question here. What are the fruits of the Ukrainian labor with the West as well? And I think bar the reasons for abstention, the actual battle on the world stage that we see is the narrative. Who's now controlling the narrative? And the reason that I see that countries like India, like the UAE, like China are abstaining or trying to take a look at both sides is it's no longer that black and white narrative that has been pushed by the West, where we are the good guys. These for now, the communists are the bad guys. The Muslims, for a point, are the bad guys. These guys are the bad guys. So I think that narrative is now, and like you said, it's a rock that has been, this Ukraine issue is a rock that has been thrown, and the ripples have been felt across the world, where people are trying to understand, okay, I can no longer rely on my partners that I assumed would come to my help or would be on my side when things went tough for me. So I need to start looking inwards, introspectively, and think about what's good for me, my people, and the region that I'm in. So if you take it from that context, the abstention actually makes a lot of sense, because we're not looking at the situation as a black and white, good versus bad. We as the UAE have always been passionate about prosperity, peace, and stability. And I think both ambassadors here would see that our effort for the region is we want prosperity for all. We want hope for the youth of the region. So for once, we look at ourselves and the region that we're in and realize that we don't need to look at other people's agendas. We need to start building our own narrative. And today is the day that we start.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Ambassador Navdeep Suri. Navdeep, can you broaden this a bit? I know you've spent a lot of time in the UAE, and of course, if there's anything you want to add on that, but you know, you've also spent years ago time in Syria, where I had the privilege of visiting you. So where are we when we look further afield? Israel's position on the issue is also being of what they call, strategic ambiguity. And is it because of what happened in Syria? Is it Russia's dominance over the Syrian airspace, for instance, for which they need? So can you just broaden this a bit?
Yes, and let me also bring in Egypt, because
right. You've been in Egypt. Yes.
Egypt too has expressed support for the Russian position. And you know, if you've lived in Cairo, as I have twice, the Arab street, the Egyptian street, is very sympathetic to Russia's steadfast support to Egypt over the years. And even years after the Egyptian government had changed its position from Russia to the United States, the public hasn't forgotten. And I think, the point that Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad made, the Americans hurt their cause with their inconsistency. And at the end of the day, trust and confidence and reliability and credibility are words that carry a lot of weight. And the US comes short on these parameters in the eyes of some of its key interlocutors. I mean, I would add to what Said said about UAE to start with. I was there when the discussions were taking place on the Iran nuclear deal. And the Emiratis were livid because they said, you are focusing on the Iranian nuclear program, but you're forgetting Iranian interference and its use of Shia communities in this Shia arc from Yemen and Bahrain and Iraq into Syria and into Lebanon. So, there is that angst against the American position, which is fairly well established. And so what you're seeing is countries not getting pulled into the US narrative. I don't think there's any support for Russian military action in Ukraine. I think one should be clear. And everybody realizes the perils posed by that action and its violation of international norms. But it's an effort to try and balance two negatives.
Okay.
And come out with a position. And on Syria, I think you already articulated, I think the reason the Israeli Prime Minister made this urgent visit to Moscow was to make sure that they retain their freedom to strike at Hezbollah targets and others in Syria without any Russian interference.
And if I can come back to Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, because, one of the things that's happening, and again, the UAE is involved. Recently, there were two contradictory statements I read about. your ambassador in Washington said that you're going to start the oil production, you're going to ramp it up. And the prices went down. And then the petroleum minister said, no, that's wrong. And then the prices went up again. So that shows the UAE is sending a clear message to the US that, don't mess around with us. We can really cause trouble. So I'm going to bring back Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, particularly from your experience in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as to what is the energy aspect of this? I mean, the US wants the OPEC Plus to make up for Russia, bring down the costs. Are they going to do it? What do you see happening there?
The energy aspect is a very major part of the fallout of what is happening in Ukraine. As usual, the Americans have messed it up. They have announced abruptly that they are banning these exports of energy items from Russia without consulting their European partners and without preparing the Gulf producers. Abruptly, you make an announcement in Washington, D.C. The Europeans have already moved out. They said they are not imposing any of those bans at all because they crucially depend on Russian supplies that no one else can make up for. As far as OPEC Plus is concerned, it wasn't born yesterday. It is something that has been in position from 2016, and it is to safeguard the collective interests of oil producers. And it is happening. It is working. There is no reason for them to now abandon this coalition because the Americans have issued a diktat in Washington, D.C. It makes no sense. I personally feel that the Americans have got most things wrong. And I think they are going to pay a very heavy price for this. They are being propelled by domestic considerations. Because Biden looks seriously pathetic today, he has got an approval rating that is rock bottom. He has looked really bad as far as Afghanistan is concerned. He doesn't have a domestic agenda that is working. His own party has subverted it. He needed something to look good. And he's got all these swing voters from the right whom he wants to bring on board and hence look tough as far as Russia is concerned and show Putin where he gets off. This is the kind of motivation for a serious country. This is the kind of thing that a major superpower should be doing. There is no one with them today. Nobody seriously as far as energy is concerned. Energy is something that affects all of us. There is a single market as far as the world is concerned. And it is very sensitive to all geopolitical, interventions and geopolitical development. You can't just fool around. And today you have prices of $125, $130 entirely due to the foolishness of the American side.
But not just oil and gas. Russia, I believe, and Ukraine are a major supplier to your country and other countries of wheat, of sunflower. And I think it's ultimately the UAE because, 80% of the investment from the Gulf is from the UAE into Russia. So am I right that these are considerations which matter, or?
I think all of these considerations matter, and I think the time to just follow a specific direction and a specific narrative is over. Really, I think this is actually an opportunity for a lot of these countries and players in the Middle East to really have their word on the world stage instead of just being viewed as puppets, being viewed as they will always take this side, or we can always guarantee on your vote. It is actually a time to stand up and really look at where your interests lie, but also look at where your, like you said, reliable partners exist. I don't think the world is better off with an imbalance in power. If let's say Russia made a mistake in this, and I want to reiterate what was said before about nobody wants to see bloodshed, nobody wants a war, nobody wants to see people get hurt and die. But it's happened, so now we deal with the reality. Maybe Russia has made a mistake, and that would put them in a bad position. But you shouldn't really, corner an angry bear either. But if that does happen, and the swing of power goes back to the West, and China's the only one, or India as a player as well, but struggling to kind of balance out vacuum that is left by Russian power and influence, I don't think the world is better off. So we need to look at how to keep the balance across the board, but also be a player on that stage.
Yeah. So what I'm getting from the discussion is two things. One is a kind of disillusionment with America's record in the Middle East, and the second is a kind of a subterranean anger. The anger, for instance, I think that's nobody's talking about it. That look, these are European refugees, so you're welcoming them in Europe. But when you had refugees from Syria, your attitude was wrong. So I want to bring in Navdeep here on this aspect, plus another aspect, Navdeep, if, when under Trump, the American sort of relationship looked very different. And particularly with the so-called, I know there are issues whether we should call them or not, the Abrahamic Accords, when Israel was suddenly, and you've had visits by, the Israeli leadership, things were looking very different. So how is that construct going to be maintained, strengthened, weakened? And in that context, what's happening to the new Quad in which we have jumped in?
Okay, that's a lot of different.
No, you don't have to answer all of them.
Yeah.
So, but the others can come in whenever it is.
Let me just say that if the Trump administration had one single success in foreign policy, that was the Abraham Accords. And the fact that they've not only continued during the Biden administration, but actually strengthened. Even for some people like us who watched the region for a long time and lived in the region, if somebody had told me 2 years back that UAE and Israel would have the kind of vibrant relationship that they've established since August 2020, I would have said, you're smoking something. I had seen the Egypt-Israel relationship post the Camp David Accords 4 decades ago. And the best you had between Egypt and Israel was a cold peace, not the kind of multifaceted relationship that has developed so quickly between UAE and Israel. It's happened with Bahrain. The Israeli Prime Minister has visited. And don't be surprised in a year or two if Saudi Arabia is next, because there are enough indications of that they're waiting for the situation to be more amenable before they go into it. So, there is no doubt that what it has done is reconfigured the geopolitics of the Middle East to a certain extent. India sees opportunities in this. And so, this notion of a West Asia Quad, which brings in United States, Israel, India, and UAE together, at this point in an informal grouping, but I was told that a foreign ministers meeting is likely to take place in Dubai this month between the 4 foreign ministers. Let's see if post-Ukraine it still happens or not. But I think it creates interesting new avenues for engagement. And UAE, I think, sees itself as a bridge between India and Israel as a country that can marry its capital with Israeli technology and India's markets and scale to create something interesting out of it.
Yeah, and reduce tension and conflict as well. So the more bridges you build across nations, the less there's that tension in the region.
Thank you. I want to even now take it like open the lens a bit more, Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, and that's I find it fascinating, the role of Turkey. The only country which has managed to get the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine together is Turkey. They met in Antalya, not very successfully, but they met. And Turkey, why is it's a NATO member. It's sending weapons and drones to Ukraine. It's not still condemning Russia, but at the same time, it's closed the Straits of Bosphorus and Dardanelles for Russian ships. Why is Erdogan doing this? With what hope, what success?
Before I talk about Turkey, let me make one point clear. There is no Abraham Accord. please don't bring an Old Testament prophet into a thoroughly opportunistic engagement, which was engineered for the various electoral considerations of Donald Trump and Netanyahu. Both are today part of history for the time being, though they may bounce back. Do not accord that engagement any significance beyond what happened in a particular moment. As far as UAE is concerned, they have had engagement with the Israelis for several years, and it is their prerogative. But why do you bring in Abraham into this? It is their sovereign right. You can attach the term Abraham to an accord once the Israelis have an accord with the Palestinians. That is the significant, that the whole region is waiting for that. Unless you do that, why do you bring in the Old Testament? All the focus is on the Arabs. Everyone in the Arab world is telling the Israelis, do something about Palestine. And on that, you don't want to budge. You want to have everything from the Arabs without accommodating this elephant right in front of you, the Palestinian. You have an engagement there. You will have a sea change as far as the region is concerned. Now bringing in Turkey. Turkey is difficult to comprehend. Erdogan has a certain image of himself. He is the new Sultan. He is the Ottoman Sultan of Turkey. And he is inspired not by Kemal Atatürk, but the Ottoman rulers of the at the time when the Turks were at the peak of their power. So he has a very significant political agenda as far as the region is concerned. It brings in maritime aspects. It also brings in doctrinal aspects. He wants to be a sort of leader of the Islamic world, just as the Ottoman sultans used to be. But he doesn't have as yet the capacity at home. The Ottomans at their peak were a significant role player in world affairs. And their sultan used to be the real leader of the Islamic community. Erdogan doesn't have that kind of ballast. So Erdogan has much more illusion than capacity. But he is a very difficult person to predict, because he also has a domestic constituency. And then wherever things go bad at home, he becomes much more, and he becomes ultra-nationalistic and starts waving the Ottoman flag. Now, he had this period of brinkmanship during the Trump era because Donald Trump liked him. Donald Trump used to like all these what he called strong men, and he liked Erdogan. He was hated in the administration, but Donald Trump liked. That era has gone. Today, Biden has made it clear that he wants Erdogan to behave himself like a NATO partner rather than a maverick. But Erdogan has gone too far. He is engaged with the Russians, very deeply embedded with them as far as defense, politics, and economics is concerned. He's also very close to the Chinese. He is talking about strategic autonomy for his country. And that is something we can support. But autonomy, strategic autonomy in times of churn, in times of discord, in times of turmoil becomes brinkmanship. Now, whether it becomes brinkmanship or he has the capacity to hold the center is something we have to wait and see. He is now reaching out like a statesman. He's talking to everybody because he has this hard and soft approach. Talk to everybody on one hand, but keep on asserting the Turkish interest on the other. So I think we are looking at the situation as of now in it's a very ambivalent situation, and we don't know which way it will go, because he also had accommodated the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers, and they had a dialogue in Turkey. And that means he's a role player right there. What you are looking at, if I may put it down geopolitically, already West Asia and North Africa are an integrated strategic landscape. I think you should bring in the Caucasus as well. And once you bring in the Caucasus, you're also looking at Central Asia. And then you're looking at Russia and China. So it is a very large space of Eurasia in which West Asia is also involved. And that is where India comes in. Because India is not part of the picture. India is a part of Eurasia and is part of the Indian Ocean, is not a player in any of these very significant events that are taking place.
Thank you. And, we've talked Turkey. Let's go to the other end, a country we haven't talked about, but I think country which you can't avoid talking about in this situation. We should face it, Iran. Iran has taken a very interesting position on Ukraine. I mean, Officially, of course, they are, the hardline position is in support of Russia, but there are a lot of voices in Iran which are not happy with that. And in some places, this is if Iran could have taken advantage of this, if Russian gas doesn't go to Europe, maybe Iran could have seen an opening, but that's not what's happening. So perhaps, Said, if you start off with what you see, because there have been toing and froing between UAE and Iran recently. How do you see Iran's role here, particularly vis-a-vis UAE, Iran, US? And then Navdeep, I pass it on to you is to do the JCPOA. What's the impact on the JCPOA of Ukraine and what's going to happen? So please.
Yeah, I think with Iran, it's a mixed bag. You really never know what you're going to get. There is, it's not a secret that we have our issues with their expansionist approach in the region where, our collective national security is concerned. But I think, you mentioned something that is usually ignored by most media outlets, which is the internal wave of influence of the actual people in Iran. And I don't think any constituent in any country right now is able to really fully back one side or the other. So when they see that their government has taken a solid stance and they do not look at the other side of the story, that's when you have some resentment that will actually lead to internal strife. So we're looking at it with great interest at what's happening, what stand they're taking, but also we're listening to the street as well. It will be very interesting to see how the Iranian people look at their government stance. I think there is a lot of disinterest in their approach to local affairs originally, but now when you take it to the world stage and you are so disconnected from what people are actually, similarly to what we might see in Russia, perhaps, if Putin really goes hardline into a direction that the majority of people are now refusing to go along with, what happens next? So having a neighbor with that kind of unstable relationship internally with their people is something to watch out for.
Mm-hmm. Navtej, on the JCPOA, and it just shows how rapidly things move.
JCPOA is the nuclear treaty with which Trump pulled the US out of, and there are talks going on. So just to bring everybody up to speed. Yeah.
Right, the shorthand for which is the Iran nuclear deal. At the start of this week, there was a reasonable degree of optimism that the final document could be inked by the end of this week, or perhaps as early as that. Curiously, even while the standoff in Ukraine was going on, the Russians and the Americans were cooperating in Vienna on taking the process forward, and some of the positive soundings were actually coming out of the Russians. I understand that a final document has been given to the Iranian leadership, and it is for them to now come back on that. The Russians have thrown a bit of a googly by saying that how can you lift sanctions on Iranian oil and put sanctions on us at the same time, and how do the two go together? But Navtej, I want to bring an Indian aspect into this discussion, because if oil prices remain above $100 a barrel, it potentially shaves off 1 percentage point of GDP growth for India. That's how large the impact on the Indian deficit is, on the Indian economy is, on the fiscal space that the government has, on the inflationary impact that it generates. So purely as somebody from India, I would be rooting for the nuclear deal to come through. I would be rooting for sanctions on Iran to be lifted so that their oil supplies can come back into the market. I would say if the Americans are today thinking of changing their position on Venezuela, where they had again unilaterally imposed sanctions on Venezuela and taken out a large chunk of Venezuelan oil supplies, if those supplies come into the market, it immediately sends a signal to the very sensitive markets that that Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad spoke about. So I think it is, from an Indian perspective, we need to see what works for us. And it is in the Indian interest to try and calm tensions in Ukraine. It is in the Indian interest to see, can we give a leg up to the Iran talks and weigh in favor of a settlement. And just one last point, I would say, something on the Abraham Accords, right? Look, I have seen the shift in mood take place in Abu Dhabi. I have seen the way the government's narrative has changed to delete references to anti-Semitism from books, to create a ministry of tolerance that promotes interfaith harmony, to have this complex in Abu Dhabi where you'll have a synagogue, a mosque, and a church in the same compound. And having seen it fairly closely, all I would say is it's not PR. There is a genuine, deep change. And to the extent that it helps in reducing tensions purely on the basis of religion, I think, from an optimistic perspective.
Well, I get the point, Navdeep, but I think the point made by Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad is you're not about religion. It's the Palestinian cause.
Of course it is.
And I think that's something
Of
which
course, yeah.
You can't negate that.
It is central.
But I'm going to come back to everybody in case there are questions. Otherwise, we'll have closing comments. So questions? Oh, there are questions. Okay, we have 5 hands. So we'll take these 5 questions. Or I have to take an online question. Start with the young man in there in the middle. Yeah. Please keep your questions short so we can accommodate people.
Okay. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a common idea floating around that the next world order is due into change. So, and by world order, I mean that the next superpower that it flowed from Portuguese to British, then America, and now for a new, it's looking for a new candidate country, like Ambassador mentioned, China and India. So what are the views of panel on this and how it's affecting India's foreign policy with regard to the Middle East?
Okay, another question. So maybe they'll all answer it together. Yes, please.
Hello. So you mentioned that when we're talking about the JCPOA, the Middle East was unhappy with the fact that while we took care of the nuclear weapons on the Iranian side, we didn't take care of the fact that Shia guerrillas were being garnered by the Iranians. Now, the narrative that an outsider hears is that the Middle East was really happy with the JCPOA. So can we just elaborate on this aspect?
Okay.
Because we couldn't really understand.
So we've got the new geopolitical leader. We've got JCPOA. One more question, then I'll throw them back.
Yeah, this is specifically regarding Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, in which he referred to the American role in the Abraham Accords, the American role in West Asia, and as well as the Israeli. So the comments about these two countries, like America and Israel, were not largely negative. You had were not positive. You had a negative take on both these countries' roles. But my observation is these two countries are the only real sustainable, long-standing democracies with a free society. So when we, yeah, I mean, you may laugh at that, but it's a fact. I feel America and Israel being democracies, we should not rule out the free world that they represent when you talk of all these things. So
okay, that's
I don't take it.
That's a great comment, and I'm sure you'll get a great answer. One online question which we are obliged to take.
Yes, the online question, Girish asks, how deep is the impact on Indian trade and commerce with the Middle East from India abstaining from voting at UNSC?
All right. So who would like to start?
Okay, let me take a shot. So yeah, on the question about the next superpower, I think there is a lot of concern about China. And you can see that China's aggressive actions in South China Sea towards its other neighbors have actually managed to bring a lot of countries together in opposition. There is a strong feeling in regional powers like Japan and Australia and India to team up and to work in a concerted manner, if not towards containing China, then certainly towards bolstering our own strengths in areas not just limited to security, but everything from the availability of vaccines to cybersecurity to 5G standards to infrastructure and so on. Let me just take one more on the.
Can I just add to this, just to the question? I think it will take a very long time for another superpower to take that space, because it's no longer about 14th century or 15th century military power, economic power. The power of culture now, that is the Western narrative, the American narrative of culture through whatever media, social media, movies, Hollywood, is still has a grip on world thought. So I don't think that it will be that easy to suddenly switch. Oh, now it's a superpower. So I think the cultural aspect will make that void very, very long to fill. Go ahead. I think you wanted to.
The great stalwart of democracy and freedom, United States, bombed Iraq for 3 days, and in the first day killed 100,000 people. In the US occupation that followed, more than 1.5 million Iraqis were killed. This is after that they have bombed Afghanistan in 2001, carpet bombing, 30,000 Afghans killed. They associated themselves with the European forces and bombed Tripoli, 30,000 Libyans killed. All these states damaged beyond repair, struggling to come back. None of them has experienced the fresh bloom of American democracy anywhere in West Asia. The United States does not support democracy anywhere because it relishes authoritarian rulers who can then subordinate themselves to the American interest. That has happened so far and which is now being corrected. Israel is a democracy for a very small section of Jewish people. A democracy, to my mind, is an accommodative order that brings together everyone on the same plane constitutionally, legally, and politically. It is not the case. In the case of Israel, there are two kinds of citizenship. One that favors the Jews, the other that does not. Israel also has a huge population of people, the Palestinian people who live under their occupation. They have been living under their occupation for 70 years. Many of them have been despoiled and their properties taken away from them. If this is a democratic order you're talking about, I think forget about it. There is no such thing. This is a fable that has been projected as part of PR that Israel is the only democracy in West Asia. It is not. Now, with regard to the New World Order, yes, it is being shaped right in front of us. It won't have a superpower of the kind we have. A New World Order changes or emerges over time in a set of circumstances. What we are looking at today is not that we are not looking at American power being diminished. It is not, perhaps. It has lost credibility, it has lost authority, and it is somehow disengaged. Its own domestic politics is very deeply polarized, and it looks like a broken, dysfunctional country for an outsider. But others have come up. It's not as if America has become ineffective. For various reasons it has, but others have come out. So what you are looking at is a multipolar order. It's already there, and it will take certain shape. What the Americans are concerned about today, and that is why we are looking at the situation so carefully, they don't want this order to emerge either. They want American hegemony, whatever the situation. Now they are fighting to the last Ukrainian. They fought to the last Iraqi, fought to the last Afghan, fought to the last Libyan. They will continue on that. They are a very violent country. Have you ever heard the word American diplomacy? Have you ever heard the name of any great American diplomat functioning as far as West Asia is concerned? Not at all. It's always military power. Whatever the situation, they will unleash their military power and kill hundreds of thousands of people within a few days. Iran is a country in their crosshair because it stands up to the Americans. They have a revolution. You don't like it. It has become a pariah nation. 50 years they have suffered. 40 years plus they have suffered American sanctions, which have become even more cruel. As far as Trump is concerned, his sanctions brought 20 million Iranians who were middle class, like you and me, they have gone below the poverty line. 5 years. Because of Donald Trump's sanctions, when the Iranians were fully in compliance with the JCPOA. What is the issue today in Vienna? It is not Iran, it is the United States. They have to come back to the agreement. Now, they are reluctant because of the domestic situation. They're going to have elections shortly. This president is already de facto lame duck. He's going to become de jure lame duck. He is worried about sanctions. He's talking about concessions. It's not concessions. You have to give back to the Iranians what you took away unilaterally. That is the narrative. Those are the political issues that they have to address.
Well, we could go on and on. This is absolutely fascinating, but I'm getting very desperate signals and we have to cut this here. Thank you so much. Give a hand to all our panelists. Please.
Thank you.
We thank Saeed Al-Saeed, Navdeep Suri, Talmiz Ahmad, and Navtej Sarna for a very topical, informed, and insightful discussion. We also thank ABP for their support. The authors will be signing their book at the